Gwen Harper had a rule, a simple one. Keep your head down, do your job, and never, ever cry where someone important could see you. For 3 years, she had followed that rule without a single slip. 3 years of mopping marble floors at Vance Enterprises, 3 years of polishing brass door handles on the 42nd floor, where the air smelled like expensive cologne and fresh printer ink. 3 years of pushing her cleaning cart past the frosted glass door that read Mason Vance, Chief Executive Officer, without so much as glancing inside. She knew what people whispered about the man behind that door. They said Mason Vance controlled half the commercial real estate on Chicago's West Side. They said his security consulting firm was really a front for one of the most powerful syndicates in the Midwest. They said men who crossed him didn't end up hurt. They ended up broke, blacklisted, and begging for table scraps in cities where nobody remembered their names. Gwen didn't care about any of that. She cared about her mop, her paycheck, and getting home before the last bus at 11:15. But today, on a Tuesday morning in October, with autumn rain streaking down the floor-to-ceiling windows at the end of the hallway, her rule was about to shatter into 1,000 pieces. It started with her phone buzzing in the front pocket of her apron. She almost ignored it. Personal calls during work hours were against company policy, and Gwen was nothing if she wasn't careful about policy. But then, the phone buzzed again. And again. 4 times in a row, each vibration more aggressive than the last, like whoever was calling knew she was trying to pretend they didn't exist. She pulled the phone out and looked at the screen. Victor Cross. Her stomach dropped straight through the floor. She answered with shaking fingers. "Hello?" "Gwen." The voice on the other end was calm. Too calm. The kind of calm that made the hair on the back of your neck stand up. "I'm going to keep this short because I respect your time. You have until midnight tonight to deliver the full payment, every single dollar. If you don't, I'm shutting down every delivery route into your little market. No produce, no dry goods, no imports. Nothing gets in, nothing gets out. Your people will be staring at empty shelves by Thursday morning." Gwen pressed her back against the hallway wall. Her knees felt like they were made of wet cardboard. "Victor, please. The association doesn't have that kind of money. We already paid you last month. You raised the amount again and we can't—" "That's not my concern." "These are families, small shop owners. They have kids. They have—" "Midnight, Gwen." The line didn't go dead. That was the worst part. He stayed on, breathing, waiting, letting the silence do the work that words couldn't. And that silence broke her. Gwen's legs gave out. She slid down the wall until she was sitting on the freshly mopped marble, her cleaning cart rolling a few inches away from the force of her shoulder bumping it. A choked sound came out of her throat, ugly and raw and completely beyond her control. She pressed her free hand over her mouth, trying to hold it in, but the tears were already falling, hot and fast, streaking down her round cheeks and dripping off her chin onto her uniform. 3 years. 3 years of keeping it together, of being the one person everyone in the West Side historic market could count on. She managed their books. She tracked their invoices. She negotiated with suppliers and kept the Merchant Association's treasury balanced down to the last cent. All of that on top of scrubbing floors 42 stories above the city for 8 hours a day, just to keep her own rent paid. And Victor Cross wanted to destroy all of it with a single phone call. She was so deep in her own collapse that she didn't hear the frosted glass door open 20 feet down the hall. Mason Vance had been reviewing quarterly projections when the sound reached him. At first, he thought someone had dropped something, a cart maybe, or a stack of supplies. But then he heard the crying. Quiet, desperate crying. The kind of sound a person makes when they think nobody is listening. He stepped into the hallway and saw her, the cleaning lady. He'd seen her dozens of times before, always working, always quiet, always moving with this determined efficiency that he privately respected. She was sitting on the floor now, with her phone pressed to her ear, tears running down her face and her whole body trembling like she was trying to hold up a weight that had finally gotten too heavy. Mason walked toward her. His shoes made almost no sound on the marble. Gwen looked up, and her face went white. Of all the people in this building, of all the people on this entire planet, the absolute last person she wanted to see her like this was Mason Vance. She scrambled to get up, wiping her face with the back of her hand, mumbling apologies that tripped over each other on the way out of her mouth. "I'm sorry, Mr. Vance. I didn't mean to. I'll move. It won't happen again. Mason held up one hand. His expression was unreadable. Then he looked at the phone still clutched in her other hand. She could hear Victor's voice still coming through the speaker, tinny and distant, repeating her name. "Who is that?" Mason asked. "Nobody. It's nothing. I'm fine." "You're sitting on my floor crying. That's not nothing." Before Gwen could answer, Victor's voice came through the phone again, sharp enough to carry. "Gwen, are you still there? I need confirmation. Midnight. Do you understand me?" Mason extended his hand, palm up, fingers open. He didn't grab the phone. He waited. Gwen stared at him. Every survival instinct she had screamed at her to refuse, to apologize again, to pick up her cart and disappear into the service elevator and never speak of this moment for the rest of her life. Instead, with a trembling hand, she gave him the phone. Mason lifted it to his ear. He leaned one shoulder against the hallway wall, casual as a man checking the weather. "Mr. Cross," he said. His voice was low and even. "My name is Mason Vance. I believe you're speaking to someone who falls under my protection. Whatever territory you think you're squeezing, you're speaking to its owner now." The silence on the other end of the line lasted exactly 4 seconds. Then Victor Cross hung up. Mason looked at the phone for a moment, then handed it back to Gwen. She took it with fingers that had gone completely numb. "Come inside," he said, tilting his head toward his office. "I think you and I need to have a conversation." Gwen opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. A dozen thoughts fought for space in her head. Confusion, fear, relief, suspicion, and something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Hope. She picked up her mop, leaned it against the cleaning cart, and followed Mason Vance through the frosted glass door. Behind her, the phone screen still glowed with Victor Cross's name. And somewhere across the city, a man who had built his empire on fear was staring at his own phone, hearing a name he never expected to hear, and realizing that the easiest target he'd ever chosen had just become the most dangerous mistake of his career. Mason's office was nothing like Gwen had imagined. She had cleaned the hallway outside this room hundreds of times, and in her mind, she had always pictured something cold. Steel furniture, maybe. Dark leather chairs. The kind of space that made you feel small on purpose. Instead, the room was warm. A deep walnut desk sat near the windows, covered in neat stacks of paper, and 2 monitors angled side by side. Bookshelves lined the left wall, filled with actual books. History, economics, urban planning. Spines cracked and worn from use. A small coffee station sat in the corner with a ceramic mug that said, "World's Okayest Boss," in faded letters. Someone had given it to him as a joke, clearly, but the fact that he used it told Gwen something she didn't expect. Mason pulled a chair out from the small conference table near the window and gestured for her to sit. She hesitated. Her uniform still had a damp patch on the knee from the floor, and she was suddenly very aware of the fact that she smelled like lemon cleaning solution. "Sit down, Gwen," Mason said. There was no impatience in his voice. He said it the way you'd talk to someone who had been standing too long and needed permission to rest. She sat. Mason poured 2 cups of coffee from the station without asking if she wanted one. He set a mug in front of her, the normal one, not the joke mug, and took the seat across from her. "Start from the beginning," he said. Gwen wrapped both hands around the warm ceramic. She didn't drink, she just held it, letting the heat seep into her fingers, while she figured out where the beginning even was. "I grew up on the west side," she said. "The historic market. You probably know it. 30-something shops, mostly family-owned. Grocers, a bakery, a fabric store, a couple of restaurants. My grandmother had a flower stall there for 40 years before she passed." Mason nodded. He knew the area. Prime real estate that developers had been circling for years, but the merchants had held on through sheer stubbornness and community loyalty. About 6 years ago, the shop owners formed a merchants association to pool resources. Shared advertising, bulk supply orders, group insurance, that kind of thing. They needed someone to handle the money. Gwen paused. "I'm good with numbers, always have been, so they asked me." "You're the treasurer?" "Officially, yes. Unofficially, I'm the treasurer, the accountant, the negotiator, the person who calls the suppliers when shipments are late, and the one who sits with Mrs. Delgado at the bakery for an hour every quarter, explaining why she can't write off her nephew's birthday cake as a business expense." The corner of Mason's mouth moved. Almost a smile. "And Victor Cross?" Gwen's grip tightened on the mug. "He showed up about 14 months ago. Came into the market with 2 men in expensive suits, walked into every shop and explained that he was offering commercial protection services. 20% of monthly revenue from each business paid directly to his company. Anyone who refused would find their supply deliveries mysteriously delayed, their insurance claims denied, their health inspections suddenly finding violations that didn't exist the week before." "Classic shakedown," Mason said. "We tried to fight it at first, filed complaints, talked to lawyers, but Cross is careful. Everything runs through legitimate-looking contracts and invoices. On paper, the shop owners are voluntarily paying for consulting services they never asked for and never received. The lawyers said it would take years to untangle, and none of us had that kind of time or money." "So you paid?" "We paid. For 14 months, we paid. I reworked every budget in the association to absorb the cost, cut maintenance funds, delayed repairs, pushed supplier payments to the absolute last day. I squeezed every dollar until there was nothing left to squeeze." Gwen finally took a sip of the coffee. It was strong and good. "Then last month, Cross raised the percentage, 25%, and 3 days ago, he raised it again, 30%. That phone call you heard, that was him telling me if we don't pay the new rate by midnight, he cuts off our entire supply chain." Mason leaned back in his chair. His expression hadn't changed much during her story, but Gwen noticed his jaw had tightened about 2 sentences in and hadn't relaxed since. "You have the financial records?" he asked. "The invoices, the payment history, the contracts he made the shop owners sign?" "Every single page. I keep copies of everything. Digital backups, paper backups, and a third set in a safety deposit box because I'm paranoid." That time, Mason actually did smile. Brief, but real. That's not paranoia. That's good accounting. He stood and walked to his desk, pressing a button on his phone. "Ray, I need you to clear my afternoon, all of it, and pull everything we have on Victor Cross. Business filings, known associates, property records, financial connections. I want it in the conference room in 30 minutes. A voice on the speaker responded with a crisp, "Done." Mason turned back to Gwen. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to bring me every record you have, and we're going to go through them line by line. I have a forensic accounting team that can trace where Cross's money actually goes once it leaves your merchant's hands. If he's running this through shell companies, and a man like Cross always is, there's a paper trail, and we're going to find it." Gwen set down her mug. "Mr. Vance."
"I appreciate this, I really do, but I have to ask, why?
"You don't know me. I clean your floors. Why would you get involved in something like this?" Mason was quiet for a moment. He looked out the window at the city stretching below, the towers of glass and steel closer to downtown, and further west, the older neighborhoods where brick buildings and hand-painted shop signs still held their ground against the skyline. "Because men like Victor Cross don't stop at one market," he said. "They take what's easy, and then they move to the next block, and the next one after that. I've watched it happen 3 times in this city in the last decade. By the time anyone with resources notices, there's nothing left to save. He looked back at her. I'm noticing now, so we handle it now. He opened a drawer and pulled out a key card, sliding it across the desk to her.
There's a secure residential suite on the 38th floor. Corporate housing for visiting executives. You're staying there tonight. If Cross knows your name and your phone number, he knows where you live, and I'm not sending you back to an address he can reach. Gwen picked up the key card. It was heavier than she expected, or maybe that was just the weight of everything that had changed in the last hour. I need to get the records from my apartment, she said. Give Ray your address. He'll send a team to collect whatever you need. Clothes, documents, anything personal. They'll have it here within 2 hours. Gwen stood, holding the keycard against her chest. She wanted to say something meaningful, something that matched the size of what this man was offering her. But the words that came out were small and honest, and exactly enough. Thank you. Mason nodded once and reached for his phone. He had 14 calls to make before the sun went down, and the first one was to a man who owed him a very large favor at the county records office. The clock on his wall read 11:47 a.m. They had 12 hours and 13 minutes until Victor Cross's deadline, and Mason Vance intended to use every single one of them. The morning air had that sharp October bite to it when Mason's black SUV pulled up along the curb outside the historic market square. Gwen sat in the passenger seat, clutching a leather folder stuffed with printed spreadsheets and contact lists she had organized until 2 in the morning. She hadn't slept much. The suite on the 38th floor had a bed softer than anything she'd ever owned, a shower with water pressure that could probably strip paint, and a small kitchen stocked with groceries that someone had placed there specifically for her. She had stood in the middle of that room for a full 5 minutes after Ray dropped off her things, just turning in a slow circle, trying to understand how her life had rearranged itself so completely in 12 hours. But comfort didn't quiet her mind. Every time she closed her eyes, she heard Victor's voice on the phone. Midnight, Gwen. The deadline had passed without incident. No calls, no threats, no retaliation. Yet. That silence scared her more than anything Cross could have said. Mason turned off the engine and studied the market through the windshield. The historic market square occupied an entire city block on the west side. It was old, built in the 1920s as an open-air trading post, then slowly enclosed and expanded over the decades into a connected network of small storefronts sharing walls and covered walkways. The architecture was beautiful in the stubborn way that old things are beautiful. Faded brick facades with arched windows, hand-lettered signs in English, Spanish, Korean, and Arabic. Awnings in colors that had been bright once and now carried the dignified softness of years in the sun. How many businesses total? Mason asked. 34 active storefronts, Gwen said. 8 more in the back section that share kitchen and storage space, plus 12 street vendors who rent table spots on weekends. And they all pay into Cross's scheme. Every one of them. The street vendors too, even though most of them barely clear $200 on a good Saturday. Mason's jaw tightened the same way it had yesterday. Gwen was starting to recognize that expression. It meant he was doing math in his head, calculating angles, measuring distances between the problem and the solution. Let's go meet your people, he said. They walked through the main entrance together, and Gwen felt the shift immediately. The market was awake. Shop owners unlocking doors, dragging out sidewalk displays, starting coffee machines. But the energy was wrong. Quieter than usual. People moved with their shoulders hunched and their eyes on the ground. Gwen recognized it because she had been carrying the same weight herself for 14 months. Fear had a posture, and every person in this building was wearing it. Mrs. Delgado saw them first. She was arranging pastries in the bakery window and froze mid-reach when she spotted Gwen walking beside a tall man in a tailored charcoal coat. Gwen? Who is? Elena, I need you to spread the word. Everyone in the main hall in 20 minutes. All owners, all managers. Tell them it's important." Mrs. Delgado looked at Mason, then back at Gwen, then at Mason again. She set down her tray of conchas and disappeared into the back of the bakery without another word. Within 3 minutes, Gwen could hear the chain reaction. Voices calling across hallways, phones buzzing, the squeak of shoes on tile as people moved toward the central gathering space. The main hall was a wide open area at the heart of the market where the walkways converged. It had a vaulted ceiling with old skylights that let in pale morning sun and enough space for the shop owners to gather in a loose semicircle around a raised platform that normally held weekend musicians. Gwen stood on that platform with Mason beside her. 46 faces stared up at them, tired, curious, cautious. She kept it simple. She told them that she had secured the support of Mason Vance and his organization, that Vance Enterprises would be providing licensed security personnel to patrol the market during business hours, that every existing contract and invoice connected to Cross's operation was being reviewed by a professional forensic accounting team, and that from this moment forward, no merchant in this association would make another payment to Victor Cross or anyone connected to him. The silence after she finished was thick enough to lean on. Then Mr. Yoon, who ran the fabric shop near the east entrance, raised his hand. "And when Cross sends his people, what happens then?" Mason stepped forward. He didn't raise his voice. He spoke the way a man speaks when he's used to being listened to and has never needed volume to make it happen. "Every business in this market is going to receive a formal security services contract with Vance Enterprises, legally binding, fully documented, filed with the proper licensing authorities. When Cross's people show up and tell you that you owe them money, you hand them a copy of that contract and tell them your security needs are already covered by a licensed provider. They can take it up with my legal department." "And if they don't care about your contract?" Mr. Yoon pressed. "Then they'll be interfering with a licensed business operation, which gives us grounds to involve law enforcement with full documentation already in place. Cross has survived this long because everything he does looks legal on the surface. We're going to make sure everything we do actually is legal, all the way through. That takes away every tool he has." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some faces looked relieved, others still looked scared. Gwen understood both reactions. Mason's security team arrived within the hour. 4 men and 2 women in professional uniforms with visible identification badges and earpieces. They positioned themselves at the market's 3 main entrances and began a quiet, methodical walkthrough of every corridor and exit point. It was just past 11 when the front entrance darkened. 3 men walked in wearing black jackets and expressions that said they were used to owning whatever room they stepped into. Gwen recognized the one in front, Danny Harlan, one of Cross's regular collectors. He was tall, lean, and had a habit of cracking his knuckles while he talked, which he clearly thought was intimidating. Danny walked straight toward Mr. Yoon's fabric shop, ignoring the security personnel entirely. He leaned on the counter and smiled. "Mornin', old man. I'm here for this month's service fee. You know the drill." Mr. Yoon's hands trembled slightly, but he reached under his counter and pulled out a crisp document in a clear plastic sleeve. He placed it on the counter in front of Danny. "My security needs are handled," Mr. Yoon said. His voice wavered, but the words came out exactly as rehearsed. "By a licensed provider. You can contact their legal department." Danny picked up the document. His smile faded as his eyes moved down the page. Corporate letterhead, legal language, license numbers, filing references. The signature at the bottom belonged to Mason Vance. He looked up from the paper and found Mason standing 10 feet away, hands in his coat pockets, watching with the relaxed patience of a man who had already planned for this exact moment. "Mr. Harlan," Mason said, "you're welcome to stay and shop. The bakery makes excellent conchas. But if you're here to conduct unlicensed security business on premises already covered by a registered contract, I'd encourage you to call your employer first. I'd hate for you to create a legal problem that Mr. Cross isn't prepared to handle." Danny stared at him for a long 5 seconds. Then he looked at the 2 security personnel who had quietly positioned themselves near the shop entrance. Then he looked at the document in his hand again. He dropped the paper on the counter, turned around, and walked out. His 2 companions followed without a word. The market was silent for about 3 seconds after they left. Then Mrs. Delgado started clapping from behind her bakery counter, and the sound spread through the hall like a match catching dry grass. Applause, laughter, a few people wiping their eyes. Gwen pressed her hand to her chest and let out a breath she felt like she'd been holding for 14 months. Mason caught her eye from across the hall and gave her a single nod. One battle down. But both of them knew Cross wouldn't let this go. A man like that didn't lose a revenue stream and shrug it off. He would come back with a different angle, a different pressure point, something they hadn't prepared for yet. And he would come back soon. Gwen's phone rang at 4:47 in the morning. She was already half awake, sleeping in fragments the way she had for the past 3 nights, her brain cycling through spreadsheets and delivery schedules even in her dreams. She grabbed the phone from the nightstand in the 38th floor suite and saw the name on the screen. Tommy Reeves. He drove the lead truck for Pacific Ridge Freight, the company that handled the market's twice-weekly produce and dry goods deliveries. "Tommy, what's wrong?" "Gwen, we got a situation. We're at the interstate freight terminal on Route 55, and there are guys here telling us we can't leave. They're saying our loading permits have been flagged for a safety review, and all outbound cargo is frozen until further notice. 3 trucks are loaded and ready, and they won't let us pull out of the yard." Gwen sat up in bed. "Who told you this? Terminal management?" "That's the thing. I went to the terminal office, and the manager on duty says he got a call from some regional compliance company ordering an immediate audit of our freight documentation. He's never heard of the company before, but they sent official-looking paperwork, and he's too nervous to override it." "What's the company name?" Tommy paused. She heard paper rustling. "Meridian Logistics Compliance Group." Gwen closed her eyes. She didn't recognize the name, but she recognized the tactic. Victor Cross had shifted his attack. He couldn't squeeze the merchants directly anymore, so he was going after the supply chain instead. Choke the deliveries, empty the shelves, and let the financial pressure do what his collectors couldn't. She was dialing Mason before Tommy even finished explaining the rest. Mason answered on the second ring. His voice was alert and clear, which told Gwen either he was an extremely light sleeper or he hadn't gone to bed at all. "Cross is blocking our freight," she said. 3 trucks sitting at the Route 55 terminal. Some fake compliance company filed an audit hold." "How long ago?" "Tommy called me 2 minutes ago. The trucks were supposed to roll at 4:30. "Get dressed. I'll have the car downstairs in 15 minutes. The drive to the interstate freight terminal took 40 minutes through empty pre-dawn highways. Mason drove while Gwen sat in the passenger seat with her laptop open, pulling up every contract and shipping document connected to the market's supply chain. The glow of the screen lit her face in the dark car as her fingers moved across the keyboard. "Pacific Ridge Freight has been our carrier for 9 years, she said, reading from her files. "Clean record, fully licensed, all permits current through next March. There's no legitimate reason for a compliance hold." "There doesn't need to be a legitimate reason," Mason said. "Cross just needs the terminal manager to believe there's one long enough to delay the shipment. By the time anyone figures out the audit is fake, your market has missed its delivery window, and every perishable item on those trucks is ruined." "So what do we do? Call the terminal and explain it's fraudulent?" "The terminal manager won't take our word over official-looking paperwork from a company he can't verify. He's covering himself. We need to give him something bigger to lean on." Mason picked up his phone from the center console and made a call on speaker. The voice that answered was groggy and annoyed. "Mason, it's 5 in the morning. "Good morning, Phil. I need you to pull the freight licensing records for a company called Meridian Logistics Compliance Group. I need to know if they're registered with the State Transportation Authority, and I need to know in the next 10 minutes. Phil groaned audibly. "You're going to owe me breakfast for a month." 2 months, just get it done. Phil called back in 8 minutes. Meridian Logistics Compliance Group had no state registration, no federal filing, no business license in Illinois or any bordering state. The company existed on paper only, a ghost with a letterhead. They pulled into the freight terminal at 5:34 a.m. The yard was massive, acres of concrete under industrial floodlights, rows of loading docks, and dozens of trucks in various stages of departure. Gwen spotted Tommy's rig immediately. 3 Pacific Ridge trucks sat in a holding lane near the exit gate, engines off, drivers leaning against the cabs with coffee cups and frustrated expressions. 2 men in dark sedans were parked near the terminal office. They weren't wearing uniforms or badges. They were just sitting there, watching, making sure the hold stayed in place. Crosses people. Gwen recognized the strategy. They didn't need authority, just presence. As long as someone with a clipboard and a serious face said the trucks couldn't move, the terminal staff would comply out of sheer caution. Mason parked the SUV and walked directly to the terminal manager's office. Gwen followed, with her laptop bag over one shoulder and a folder of shipping contracts under her arm. The terminal manager was a tired-looking man named Gerald, who was clearly having the worst morning of his career. His desk was covered in printouts of the fake audit paperwork, and he kept pushing his glasses up his nose like they were the only thing keeping him from falling apart. "Mr. Gerald," Mason said, placing Phil's findings on the desk. "The company that filed this audit hold doesn't exist. No state registration, no federal charter, no licensing credentials. Whoever contacted you used fraudulent documentation to interfere with lawful freight operations. If you continue to hold these trucks based on paperwork from a non-existent company, your terminal becomes liable for every dollar of spoiled cargo and missed delivery penalties." Gerald stared at the documents. Then he stared at Mason. Then he looked at Gwen, who opened her folder and laid out 9 years of clean shipping contracts between Pacific Ridge Freight and the Merchants Association. "Every permit is current," Gwen said quietly. "Every inspection is passed. Every license is valid. These trucks should have been on the road an hour ago." Gerald picked up his desk phone, called the gate office, and authorized the release of all 3 Pacific Ridge vehicles. The entire process took 4 minutes once he made the decision, but Mason wasn't finished. He walked with Gwen back outside and stopped near the holding lane, looking at the 2 dark sedans still parked by the office. "Cross will try this again," he said. "Different terminal, different excuse, same result. We need to take the supply chain out of his reach entirely." "How?" Mason pulled out his phone and made another call. This one was shorter. "Ray, I need you to set up secondary freight routing through our own distribution contracts. Redirect the market's shipments through Vance Enterprises logistics channels. I want our carrier codes on every manifest by end of business today. If anyone tries to file a hold, they'll be filing it against us, and our legal team will have a response drafted before the ink dries." He hung up and looked at Gwen. "From now on, your supply chain runs through my network. Cross can file all the fake audits he wants. He'll be picking a fight with a legal department that has more lawyers than he has employees." Behind them, the 3 Pacific Ridge trucks rumbled to life. Tommy gave Gwen a thumbs up from the cab of the lead vehicle as the convoy rolled toward the exit gate, carrying 2 days' worth of fresh produce, baking supplies, and dry goods for 34 small businesses that were counting on them. Gwen watched the trucks disappear onto the highway ramp, taillights glowing red in the early morning gray. The market would have full shelves by opening time. Mrs. Delgado would have flour for her conchas. Mr. Yoon would have the imported thread his customers kept asking about. The weekend vendors would have produce to sell. She turned to Mason. "He's going to keep escalating, isn't he?" Mason opened the SUV door for her. "Yes. But every time he does, he spends resources and exposes another piece of his operation. And every piece he exposes is a piece we can use." Gwen climbed into the car, laptop already open again before she'd even buckled her seatbelt.
Something was nagging at her, a detail buried in the financial records she'd been reviewing for months. The fake company name, Meridian, had triggered a faint bell in the back of her memory. She'd seen something similar before, hidden in the invoice numbers cross-used for his extortion payments. She didn't say anything to Mason yet.
She needed to check first. But as they drove back toward the city, with the sunrise breaking orange and pink over the rooftops, Gwen had the feeling that Victor Cross's biggest mistake wasn't threatening the market or blocking the trucks. His biggest mistake was using the same accountant's playbook against a woman who had spent her entire adult life reading numbers the way other people read faces. Mason's suburban estate sat behind a stone wall on a quiet street 20 miles outside the city. Gwen had expected something flashy, a mansion with columns and fountains and the kind of excess that screamed money from the road. Instead, the house was a converted farmstead with a wide front porch, mature oak trees in the yard, and a security system so discreet you wouldn't notice it unless you knew what to look for. Cameras the size of golf balls tucked under eaves, motion sensors disguised as landscape lighting, a gate that looked decorative but ran on hydraulics strong enough to stop a delivery truck. Mason had moved their entire operation here on the 4th evening after Gwen mentioned that she'd feel more comfortable working somewhere with a real kitchen. The 38th floor suite was secure, but it felt like a hotel room, and hotel rooms made Gwen's brain go flat. She needed a table she could spread papers across, a pot of coffee she could keep refilling without calling anyone, and enough counter space to organize documents into the color-coded piles that made sense to her and absolutely nobody else. The study on the 2nd floor became their war room. Mason had a long oak desk pushed against the wall with 2 monitors and a secure network connection. Gwen commandeered the dining table that sat in the center of the room, covering it with 14 months of financial records until the wood surface disappeared entirely under paper. It was just past 8 in the evening. Mason was on a call in the hallway with his forensic accounting team, reviewing the preliminary findings from Cross's known business filings. Gwen had her laptop open in front of her, a calculator to her left, and a yellow legal pad to her right that was filling up with handwritten notes in her small, precise handwriting. She had been staring at the same set of invoice numbers for 40 minutes. Cross's extortion operation worked through a simple billing system. Each merchant received a monthly invoice from a company called Sentinel Commercial Services. The invoices looked professional, proper formatting, tax identification numbers, line items describing vague consulting work. If you didn't know better, you'd think the merchants were voluntarily paying for business advice they actually received. But Gwen knew better, and she had been tracking these invoices since the first one arrived 14 months ago. She kept every copy. She logged every payment amount, every date, every reference number. It was tedious work that nobody had asked her to do, but Gwen had learned a long time ago that the difference between being helpless and being prepared was usually a filing cabinet and the patience to use it. Tonight, she was looking at the reference numbers. Each invoice carried a 12-digit code in the upper right corner. Standard accounting practice. Reference numbers helped match payments to invoices during reconciliation. Most people would glance at them and move on. Gwen didn't glance at anything. She had noticed the first irregularity 3 months ago, but hadn't understood what it meant. The reference numbers weren't random. They followed a pattern, a subtle one, buried under enough variation to look arbitrary. The first 4 digits changed with each invoice, corresponding to the date. The next 3 digits matched the merchant's assigned account number within the association. Normal enough. But the last 5 digits were strange. They didn't correspond to any accounting sequence Gwen could identify, and they weren't sequential the way auto-generated numbers typically were. Tonight, with 14 months of data spread across the table, she finally saw it. She grabbed her calculator and started converting. The last 5 digits of each reference number, when grouped into pairs and matched against a basic alphanumeric cipher, the kind you'd learn in a high school math class, spelled out abbreviated account codes. Real account codes, the kind used by financial institutions to route internal transfers between numbered accounts. Gwen's pen stopped moving. She stared at her legal pad, where she had just decoded the last 30 invoices. Every single one contained a hidden account routing fragment embedded in the reference number. Someone on Cross's side, whoever generated these invoices, was embedding the destination account information directly into the billing documents, probably as a tracking mechanism for internal reconciliation within their own laundering system, which meant that somewhere in these numbers was the identity of the financial institution processing Cross's stolen money. She pulled her laptop closer and opened the banking database that the Merchants Association used for payment processing. Cross's invoices required payment through standard wire transfer, and every wire transfer recorded the receiving bank's routing number and account identifier. Gwen had all of those logged too. She cross-referenced the decoded fragments from the invoice reference numbers against the actual routing numbers used in the wire transfers. They matched. Every single one pointed to the same institution: Lakefront National Private Bank, a small, exclusive operation in the financial district that catered to high-net-worth clients and corporate accounts. The kind of place that valued discretion above everything else and didn't ask too many questions about where deposits originated. Gwen heard Mason finish his call and step back into the study. She didn't look up.
Mason?
Yeah?
Sentinel Commercial Services, the company Cross uses to send the invoices. It's a shell. We already knew that, but the invoices themselves contain embedded account codes pointing to Lakefront National Private Bank. Cross isn't just collecting money from the merchants. He's routing it through numbered accounts at Lakefront using a cipher system built directly into his own billing documents.
Mason crossed the room and stood behind her, looking down at the legal pad. Gwen had drawn a diagram connecting invoice numbers to decoded fragments to routing numbers to the bank, with arrows and annotations in 3 different colored pens.
He built his own paper trail, Mason said quietly.
He built his own paper trail,
Gwen confirmed.
Whoever designed this system needed a way to track which payments went where internally. They got clever with the reference numbers, thinking nobody on the receiving end would ever bother to decode them, and for 14 months, nobody did.
Until you.
Until me. And there's more.
Gwen flipped to a fresh page on the legal pad.
The account codes in these references aren't all the same. There are at least 4 distinct routing patterns, which means Cross is using multiple shell accounts at Lakefront to distribute the funds. That's textbook layering. Spread the money across several accounts to make it harder to trace. But now that we have the account identifiers, a forensic team can request records from the bank and map the entire flow. Every dollar in, every dollar out, every account it touched along the way.
Mason pulled up a chair and sat down next to her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The study was quiet, except for the ticking of a clock on the mantel and the faint hum of the security system.
"Gwen," he said, "you just handed us everything we need to shut him down."
She put her pen down and flexed her fingers. They were cramped from hours of writing.
"I handed us a map. We still need to walk into that bank and get the actual records. Decoded invoice references won't mean anything in front of a judge without the corresponding account statements to back them up."
Mason leaned back in his chair, his eyes still on her diagram. A slow, deliberate look crossed his face. The look of a man rearranging pieces on a board and finding that the move he needed had been sitting in front of him the whole time. "Then we walk into the bank," he said. Gwen finally looked up at him.
"You can't just walk into a private bank and demand account records. They'll throw us out before we reach the second floor."
"We don't go as investigators," Mason said. "We go as clients. Specifically, we go as a corporate audit team conducting due diligence on a potential acquisition. Lakefront has been looking for investors for the past 2 years. Their shareholder filings are public. If a company the size of Vance Enterprises expresses interest in a capital partnership, they'll open every door in the building and hand us coffee while they do it." Gwen stared at him. "That's devious." "That's business." She looked back at her color-coded paper trail, at the months of careful record-keeping that had led to this single discovery. and she felt something shift inside her chest. For 14 months, these numbers had been a burden, proof of how much her people were losing, how deeply Cross had dug into their livelihoods. Now those same numbers were a weapon, and she was the one holding it. "I'll need a suit," she said. Mason reached for his phone. "I'll call Ray." The suit Ray delivered the next morning was charcoal gray with a subtle pinstripe, tailored in a way that made Gwen feel like she was wearing someone else's life. She stood in front of the bathroom mirror at the estate, turning left and right, tugging at the blazer sleeves. She had worn plenty of professional clothes before: church dresses, interview outfits, the one good blouse she rotated for association meetings. But nothing like this. This suit had structure, authority. It said things about the person wearing it before she even opened her mouth. Her hair was pulled back in a clean twist, small gold earrings, minimal makeup. The leather portfolio under her arm contained a carefully prepared set of documents that Mason's team had assembled overnight: corporate letterhead, preliminary acquisition interest forms, due diligence checklists, and enough financial jargon to fill a semester of business school. Mason was waiting by the car in a navy suit of his own, looking exactly like a man who wore suits like that every day of his life, which he did. He gave Gwen a quick once-over when she came outside. "You look like a CFO," he said. "I feel like a kid wearing her mother's coat." "Good, use that. People who look slightly uncomfortable in expensive clothes read as new money. New money makes bankers very attentive." They drove downtown in silence, reviewing the plan one final time. The approach was straightforward. Vance Enterprises would present itself as a potential capital partner for Lakefront National Private Bank. Mason would play the role of interested CEO. Gwen would pose as his head of corporate auditing, brought along to evaluate the bank's internal account management as part of standard due diligence. Their goal was to gain access to the bank's account record system long enough for Gwen to locate and document the shell accounts linked to Cross's operation. The tricky part was time. They couldn't request specific accounts without raising suspicion. Gwen needed to find the records organically, using the coded fragments she had decoded from Cross's invoices, while appearing to conduct a routine review of the bank's overall portfolio health. Lakefront National Private Bank occupied the 14th and 15th floors of a glass tower on LaSalle Street. The lobby was all cream marble and brass fixtures, with a reception desk staffed by a woman whose smile was so polished it could have been listed as a corporate asset.
"Mr. Vance," she said, standing as they approached. "Mr. Whitfield is expecting you. Please follow me."
Arthur Whitfield was the bank's managing director, a compact man in his 60s, with silver hair and a handshake that lasted exactly 2 seconds too long. His office was decorated with framed awards and photographs of himself shaking hands with various people at charity galas. He greeted Mason with the eager warmth of a man who saw dollar signs walking through his door. "Mr. Vance, this is a genuine pleasure. When your office reached out about a potential capital partnership, I have to tell you, the entire board was thrilled. Vance Enterprises has an extraordinary reputation." "Thank you, Arthur. This is Gwen Harper, our Director of Corporate Auditing. She'll be handling the financial review component of our due diligence process. Standard procedure for any partnership we consider." Whitfield shook Gwen's hand. His eyes moved over her face with the brief, calculating attention of a man who was trying to figure out how important she actually was. Gwen met his gaze with a polite, neutral expression and said nothing. Mason had coached her on this during the drive. The less you say up front, the more weight your words carry when you do speak. Let him fill the silence. Nervous people talk. Confident people wait. Of course, Whitfield said. "We're an open book. Whatever you need to see, we'll make available. Let me introduce you to our compliance team." The next 2 hours were a carefully choreographed performance. Whitfield paraded them through conference rooms and introduced them to department heads. Mason asked broad, strategic questions about the bank's growth model, client acquisition rates, and risk management philosophy. He was charming, thorough, and genuinely knowledgeable about banking operations.
which kept Whitfield engaged and talking.
Gwen stayed quiet through most of it, taking notes on her legal pad, nodding at appropriate moments, playing the role of the diligent auditor who preferred data to conversation. She asked occasional questions, dry, technical ones about account categorization systems and internal reconciliation procedures. The kind of questions that made Whitfield's eyes glaze over slightly, but that he answered thoroughly because refusing would look like he had something to hide from a potential investor. The opening came at 2:15 in the afternoon. Whitfield brought them to the compliance department's workroom, where 3 analysts sat at terminals managing the bank's account monitoring system. He explained, with obvious pride, that Lakefront had recently upgraded to a digital portfolio management platform that allowed authorized reviewers to search accounts by routing code, account type, client category, and date range. Ms. Harper, feel free to review the system interface. Our analysts can walk you through the search functions. We want you to feel confident in the integrity of our record keeping. Gwen sat down at the terminal, the way a person sits down at a piano they've been playing their whole life. Her fingers rested on the keyboard with a familiarity that wasn't an act. She had spent years navigating financial databases for the Merchants Association. Different software, same logic. She started with broad searches, pulling up account summaries by category and date range, standard due diligence queries that any auditor would run. She asked the compliance analyst beside her routine questions about data retention policies and audit trail protocols. The analyst answered without hesitation, clearly accustomed to these kinds of reviews. Then, 12 minutes into her review, Gwen entered the first coded fragment from her legal pad.
She disguised it as a random spot check. Let me pull a sample account by routing code to verify your cross-referencing accuracy, and typed in the 5-digit sequence she had decoded from Cross's invoices. The screen populated with an account profile, Sentinel Commercial Services, opened 18 months ago. Account type, corporate operating. Current balance, $847,000. Gwen's heart rate climbed, but her face showed nothing. She made a small note on her pad and moved on, pulling up 2 legitimate accounts to maintain the pattern of random sampling. Then she entered the second coded fragment. Another shell account appeared. Different name, Ridgeline Advisory Partners, but the same account structure, same opening date window, same deposit patterns. Over the next 40 minutes, Gwen located all 4 shell accounts embedded in Cross's invoice codes. She documented the account numbers, opening dates, balance summaries, and transaction volume for each one.
She recorded everything on her legal pad in a shorthand notation that looked like standard audit marks, but actually contained every piece of information Mason's forensic team would need to file a formal records request. She never copied a file. She never downloaded anything. She never touched a USB drive or sent an email. Everything went onto paper, in her own handwriting, mixed into pages of genuine due diligence notes that would look completely unremarkable to anyone reviewing them later. At 3:40 p.m., Gwen closed her portfolio and stood up.
Thank you, she told the compliance analyst. Your system is well maintained. I have everything I need for the preliminary assessment.
Mason wrapped up his conversation with Whitfield with handshakes and promises to have his legal team send over a formal letter of interest by the end of the week. Whitfield walked them to the elevator personally, beaming like a man who had just landed the biggest client of his career. The elevator doors closed. Mason and Gwen stood side by side, watching the floor numbers descend. Neither of them spoke until they reached the lobby. They walked through the marble entrance hall, past the polished reception desk, through the revolving glass doors, and out onto the sidewalk, where the late afternoon sun caught the canyon of buildings on LaSalle Street and turned everything gold. Gwen opened her portfolio and held up the legal pad.
4 accounts, she said. Sentinel Commercial Services, Ridgeline Advisory Partners, Greystone Capital Holdings, and Northline Consulting Group. All opened within the same 2-month window. Combined balance just over $3 million. I have routing numbers, transaction volumes, and deposit frequency for all of them.
Mason looked at the legal pad, then at Gwen. Something passed across his face that she hadn't seen before. It went beyond respect, beyond professional admiration. It was the expression of a man who had just watched someone do something remarkable and was still catching up to how remarkable it actually was. You got all of that from a compliance terminal in 40 minutes without raising a single flag. I'm good with numbers, Gwen said. Mason opened the car door for her. You're good with a lot more than numbers. They drove back toward the estate with $3 million worth of evidence sitting on a yellow legal pad in Gwen's lap, and for the first time since this whole thing started, the weight in her chest felt lighter. They had Cross's money trail. They had his account numbers. They had everything they needed to turn his own system against him. Tomorrow, Mason would make the call. The waterfront diner sat at the end of a concrete pier on the south branch of the Chicago River, sandwiched between a bait shop and a marine supply store that had been closed for renovations since the Clinton administration. The kind of place where the coffee was burnt, the booths were cracked vinyl, and nobody inside cared who you were or what you did for a living. Mason had chosen it for exactly those reasons. Gwen arrived with Mason at 11:45, 15 minutes before the scheduled meeting. She wore the same charcoal suit from the bank visit, cleaned and pressed, with her leather portfolio tucked under her arm. Mason had offered to handle the meeting alone, and Gwen had turned him down with a firmness that surprised both of them. Cross has been squeezing my people for 14 months, she had said that morning over coffee at the estate. He's been calling my phone, threatening my merchants, using my invoices. I'm going to be in that room when we end it. Mason hadn't argued. The diner's interior smelled like fried onions and lake water. A waitress with tired eyes and a pen behind her ear seated them in the back corner booth, the one with a clear sightline to both the front door and the emergency exit near the kitchen. Mason ordered coffee. Gwen ordered tea and a piece of lemon cake, because she hadn't eaten breakfast and because her grandmother had always told her to never negotiate on an empty stomach. At exactly noon, Victor Cross walked through the front door. Gwen had never seen him in person before. Their entire relationship had existed through phone calls, invoices, and the second-hand fear he generated in the people she cared about. She had built an image of him in her mind over 14 months, something large and menacing, a figure that matched the size of the damage he caused. The real Victor Cross was underwhelming. He was average height, maybe 5'9", with thinning brown hair combed back from a forehead that was starting to show its age. He wore a dark blue suit that was expensive but didn't fit quite right through the shoulders, and he carried himself with the rigid posture of a man who was constantly aware of how other people perceived him. Two men followed him inside, the same type as Danny Harlan, broad and silent, and dressed like they were attending a funeral they didn't care about. Cross spotted them in the back booth and walked over. He slid into the opposite bench without greeting either of them. His two men took positions near the counter, close enough to watch, but far enough to give the appearance of a private conversation. Cross looked at Mason first, then at Gwen. His eyes lingered on her for an extra second, and something moved behind his expression. Recognition, maybe, or the particular irritation of a man realizing that the person he'd been pushing around had pushed back harder than expected. "Mr. Vance," Cross said. His voice was the same one Gwen remembered from the phone. Controlled, measured, delivered at a volume that made you lean in slightly to hear. "I'll be honest with you. When you picked up that phone last week, I assumed you were running a bluff, a businessman playing protector to impress somebody. I've seen it before." "And now?" Mason said. "Now I've had my freight operation disrupted, my collection team embarrassed, and my phone ringing with questions from people I'd prefer didn't have questions. So I'm here, which should tell you that I'm taking this seriously." Mason reached into the interior pocket of his jacket and removed a folded document. He placed it on the table and slid it across to Cross the way a dealer slides a card. Cross unfolded it. The document was a single page, a summary prepared by Mason's forensic accounting team, listing the 4 shell accounts at Lakefront National Private Bank, their balances, their transaction histories, and their connection to Sentinel Commercial Services and its related entities. At the bottom was a paragraph explaining that this information had been compiled as part of a preliminary financial crimes referral and could be submitted to banking regulators and law enforcement at any time. Gwen watched Cross read. She watched his eyes move across the page, pause, move back, pause again. She watched the color leave his face in slow degrees, like water draining from a sink. He read the document twice, then set it down on the table and placed both hands flat on either side of it. "Where did you get this?" His voice was still controlled, but the edges had gone tight. "That's not really the relevant question," Mason said. "The relevant question is what happens next. Here's what I'm proposing. You dissolve Sentinel Commercial Services and every entity connected to it. You release every contract you hold with the merchants in the historic market district. You cease all collection activity, all supply chain interference, and all communication with any business owner in that association. You do this within 72 hours, and this document stays in my filing cabinet." Cross stared at Mason for a long moment, then shifted his gaze to Gwen. "You did this," he said. It came out flat, almost confused, like he was trying to fit a piece into a puzzle and it wouldn't go where he expected. Gwen met his eyes. She didn't flinch, and she didn't smile. "You sent me invoices every month for 14 months, Mr. Cross. I read every single one of them." Something flickered behind Cross's expression. For a brief moment, Gwen thought he might actually accept the offer. She could see the calculation happening. The cost of fighting versus the cost of walking away, measured against the very real threat of having his financial infrastructure exposed and frozen. Then the moment passed, and Cross's jaw set into something harder. "You think this scares me?" he said, tapping the document with one finger. "Accounts can be moved. Companies can be restructured. You freeze these 4, I open 4 more by Friday. The market isn't the only revenue source I have, Vance. It's not even the biggest. But I'll tell you what it is. It's mine. I found it. I built the operation, and I'm not handing it over because a cleaning lady figured out how to read an invoice." The words landed exactly where Cross intended them to. Gwen felt the sting of it in her chest, sharp and familiar. She had heard variations of that dismissal her entire life. The assumption that her size, her job, her appearance meant she could be reduced to a punchline in someone else's story. Mason's expression didn't change, but Gwen noticed his right hand close slowly around his coffee cup. When he spoke, his voice was quieter than before. "You should reconsider." "I have reconsidered," Cross said, "and here's what I've decided. Your little security contracts and legal tricks work fine for a bunch of shop owners who don't know any better. But the market depends on one thing, its central distribution hub on the south side. Every product that flows into those shops passes through that warehouse first. You can guard the storefronts all you want. I'm going after the source." Cross stood up from the booth, leaving the document on the table. He buttoned his jacket with deliberate, unhurried hands. "You've got a nice operation, Vance. Smart play with the bank. But you're protecting a flea market, and I've been doing this longer than your auditor has been balancing checkbooks." He turned and walked toward the door. His 2 men fell into step behind him. The bell above the entrance jingled as they left, and then the diner was quiet again, except for the sound of the kitchen radio playing something old and soft through a speaker that buzzed on the high notes. Gwen stared at the document still sitting on the table. Her tea had gone cold. The lemon cake sat untouched on its plate. "He's going after the warehouse," she said. "Yes. He just told us exactly what he's going to do. Why would he do that?" Mason picked up the document and folded it back into his pocket. "Because he's angry, and angry people telegraph their moves. He wanted us to know he's coming because he thinks the threat alone will make us panic. He's used to people backing down once he escalates." "Are we going to back down?" Mason looked at her across the table. The faintest trace of a smile crossed his face, the kind of smile that said he had been thinking 3 steps ahead since before Cross sat down. "Gwen, I was hoping he'd say the warehouse. I've had a security team on standby for that location since yesterday morning. Cross just confirmed exactly where we need to focus. He thinks he's escalating. What he actually did was walk into a diner and hand us his entire playbook. Gwen picked up her fork and took a bite of the lemon cake. It was good, sweet and tart, and exactly what she needed in that moment.
"Then I guess we have work to do tonight," she said.
"We do," Mason agreed. He signaled the waitress for the check. "And Gwen, what he said about you in there, the cleaning lady comment."
"I heard it."
"Good. Remember it, because when this is over, I want you to remember exactly what a man with 4 shell accounts and a crumbling empire thought of the woman who took him apart with a legal pad and a calculator." Gwen finished the cake, closed her portfolio, and followed Mason out of the diner into the midday sun reflecting off the river. They had less than 24 hours before Cross made his move on the warehouse, and every one of those hours mattered. The central distribution warehouse sat on a dead-end street in the industrial district, surrounded by chain-link fencing and empty lots where weeds pushed through cracked asphalt. It was an ugly building. Corrugated steel walls, a flat roof patched in 3 places, loading docks along the south side that groaned every time a truck backed into them. The fluorescent lights inside flickered on a cycle that the maintenance guy had been promising to fix for 2 years. But ugly or not, this warehouse was the beating heart of the historic market. Every crate of produce, every pallet of dry goods, every shipment of imported spices and fabrics and specialty ingredients passed through these doors before reaching the merchant's shelves. If Cross shut this place down, even for a few days, the ripple would hollow out every shop in the market within a week. Gwen and Mason arrived at 7 in the evening, just as the day shift was finishing up and the night crew was clocking in. The sun had already dropped behind the skyline, leaving the industrial district in that bruised purple light that made everything look a little rougher than it was during the day. Gwen knew this warehouse the way she knew her own kitchen. She had been managing its operations informally for years, coordinating delivery schedules, resolving inventory disputes, making sure the cold storage units were maintained on time. The night shift supervisor, a broad-shouldered woman named Denise Okafor, met them at the main entrance with a clipboard and a deeply skeptical expression. "Gwen, when you called me an hour ago and said you were bringing security, I expected maybe a couple of guys with flashlights. This looks like you're preparing for a siege." Behind Mason's SUV, 2 unmarked vans had pulled into the parking lot. 8 members of his licensed security team were already unloading equipment, cases of electronic hardware, coils of cable, boxes marked with the logo of a commercial surveillance company.
"Denise, this is Mason Vance," Gwen said. "He's helping us deal with the Cross situation. We have reason to believe Cross is going to try to shut down the warehouse within the next 24 hours.
Denise looked Mason up and down with the frank evaluation of a woman who had spent 15 years managing night shifts in the industrial district and had developed an extremely reliable sense of who was worth trusting. Whatever she saw apparently passed inspection because she gave a single nod and held the door open wider. "Then you'd better come in and tell me what you need." They set up a command area in the warehouse supervisor's office, a cramped room with a metal desk, a wall calendar from 2 years ago, and a coffee maker so ancient it had probably witnessed the building's original construction. Mason spread a floor plan of the warehouse across the desk and began walking Denise and Gwen through the security layout. The warehouse had 4 potential entry points, 2 loading docks on the south side, a personnel door on the east, and a large roll-up gate on the north wall used for oversized freight. The chain-link perimeter fence had 2 vehicle gates, one on the street side and one connecting to the adjacent lot. The existing security was minimal. 1 camera over the main entrance, a motion-activated light on the north wall, and a padlock on the fence gate that Denise admitted she hadn't changed the combination on in over a year. "Cross doesn't need to break in," Mason explained, tracing the entry points with his finger. "His most likely approach is to block operations. Park vehicles across the loading docks, obstruct the gates, prevent trucks from entering or leaving. It's the same strategy he used at the freight terminal. He keeps everything technically non-violent, so there's no obvious criminal act to report. Just enough disruption to grind your supply chain to a halt.
So, how do we stop that? Denise asked.
We make obstruction impossible and document every attempt. Over the next 3 hours, Mason's team transformed the warehouse perimeter. They installed 12 high-definition cameras covering every angle of the building exterior, the parking lot, the fence gates, and both loading docks. Each camera fed into a central monitoring station, set up on a folding table in the supervisor's office, where a security technician named Marcus sat with 4 screens showing rotating live feeds. The fence gates received heavy-duty electronic locks controlled by keycard access, replacing the old combination padlocks. Mason's team placed bollards, thick steel posts filled with concrete, at the entrance to each loading dock, positioned so that delivery trucks could navigate in easily, but any vehicle attempting to block the dock would have to physically move 1,000 pounds of anchored steel to do it. Access control readers went up at every door. Each authorized worker received a temporary keycard programmed with their shift schedule. Anyone without a card would be flagged immediately on the monitoring system. While Mason coordinated the technical installation, Gwen worked with Denise to organize the night shift. There were 14 warehouse workers on duty between 8 p.m. and 6 a.m. Forklift operators, inventory clerks, and loading dock handlers who kept the supply chain moving through the overnight hours. These were the people who would be on the ground if Cross's crew showed up, and Gwen wanted to make sure every one of them knew the plan. She gathered them in the main floor area between the pallet racks, standing on an overturned milk crate because the warehouse floor was so wide that people in the back couldn't see her otherwise. "Here's what I need from all of you tonight," she said. "If anyone shows up who isn't on our authorized list, do not engage them. Do not argue with them. Do not try to stop them yourself. You find the nearest camera, you make sure you're visible on the feed, and you contact Marcus in the office. That's it. Every door is monitored, every gate is locked, and there are security personnel covering all 4 sides of the building. Your job tonight is the same as every night. Move freight, stock inventory, keep the trucks running. Let the security team handle everything else." A forklift operator named Carlos raised his hand. "What if they try to mess with our trucks inside the yard?" "Every vehicle in this lot is being logged and tagged tonight," Gwen said. "Any unauthorized vehicle that enters the perimeter gets recorded, time-stamped, and reported. If someone parks a car across your loading lane, we have a tow service on standby with a 7-minute response time. Mason arranged it this afternoon." Carlos looked impressed. Several other workers exchanged glances that carried a mixture of relief and the cautious optimism of people who had been dealing with Cross's shadow for too long to fully trust that someone was finally doing something about it. By midnight, the warehouse looked like a different facility. The perimeter was lit up with new floodlights that turned the parking lot bright as noon. Camera feeds scrolled across the monitoring station. Every gate was locked, every door was carded, and 2 security guards maintained a walking patrol around the building exterior in 15-minute rotations. Gwen stood at the loading dock, watching a Pacific Ridge truck back into position for its 1 a.m. unloading slot. The driver, a different one from Tommy, a quiet woman named Priya, who always wore a Dodgers cap, regardless of the season, gave Gwen a small wave from the cab. Mason came up beside her, holding 2 paper cups of coffee from the ancient machine in the office. "Denise's coffee is terrible," he said, handing her one. "Denise's coffee has kept this warehouse running for 15 years. Show some respect." Mason took a sip and grimaced slightly. "Noted." They stood together in the cold night air, watching the truck's cargo doors swing open to reveal stacked pallets of produce and packaged goods. The forklift operators moved in with practiced efficiency, pulling loads off the truck and ferrying them to their designated spots in the warehouse with the smooth rhythm of people who had done this work 1,000 times. "You think he'll come tonight?" Gwen asked. "Probably not tonight. He'll send someone to scout first. Check the perimeter, look for gaps, figure out the camera positions. When he sees what we've built here, he'll have to adjust his plan, and that adjustment will cost him time." "And when he does come?" Mason looked at her over the rim of his paper cup. When he comes, every second of it will be on camera. Every person he sends will be identified, and every piece of evidence we've been collecting will be waiting for him. Cross thinks he's about to shut down a warehouse. What he's actually walking into is the end of his operation. Gwen sipped the terrible coffee and watched the forklift lights move through the warehouse like slow, purposeful fireflies. Somewhere across the city, Victor Cross was planning his next move, convinced that brute obstruction could overwhelm what careful preparation had built. He was going to find out how wrong he was. The call from Marcus came at 5:12 in the morning.
Gwen was dozing in the supervisor's office chair, her head resting against the wall at an angle that was going to make her neck furious with her later. Mason was awake, sitting at the folding table, reviewing camera feeds with the steady patience of a man who had done this kind of waiting before. He picked up the radio before the second click. "Go ahead, Marcus." "We've got movement on the north perimeter. 4 vehicles approaching on the service road, 3 SUVs and a box truck. They're running slow, headlights off." Gwen was on her feet before Marcus finished the sentence. Sleep evaporated from her body like water off a hot pan. She moved to the monitoring station and leaned over the screens, watching the grainy green footage from the north-facing cameras. 4 shapes crawled along the service road that ran parallel to the warehouse fence, their outlines visible under the ambient glow of the industrial district's scattered streetlights. "That's them," Gwen said quietly. Mason picked up his phone and dialed a number he had pre-programmed 2 days earlier. The call connected on the first ring. "This is Vance. We have incoming at the South Side Distribution Hub, North Perimeter approach. 4 vehicles, moving without headlights. Activate the response protocol." He hung up and looked at Gwen. 15 minutes. 15 minutes for what? For the last piece of this to fall into place. On the screens, the 4 vehicles reached the north fence gate and stopped. Doors opened. Men climbed out. Gwen counted 11 in total, dressed in dark clothing, moving with the organized coordination of people who had rehearsed this. 2 of them approached the gate and examined the new electronic lock. One pulled out a set of bolt cutters and positioned them on the chain link next to the lock mechanism. Marcus's voice came through the radio again. "They're attempting to cut through the north fence. Should I activate the floods?" "Wait," Mason said. He was watching the screens with an intensity that Gwen found both reassuring and slightly unnerving. "Let them commit." The bolt cutters made it through 2 links before the man using them realized that the fence had been reinforced with steel cable threaded through the chain link at 6-inch intervals. Mason's team had installed it the previous evening, a simple modification that turned a 5-second fence cut into a 20-minute ordeal. The man with the cutters stepped back, said something to the person beside him, and gestured toward the box truck. The box truck rumbled forward and positioned itself facing the gate. They were going to ram it. "Now," Mason said. Marcus hit the flood control. Every light on the warehouse perimeter blazed to life simultaneously. 24 commercial-grade floodlights that turned the entire lot, the fence line, and 50 yards beyond it into something brighter than a stadium. The men outside froze. Several of them raised their hands to shield their eyes. On the camera feeds, their faces were suddenly clear and sharp, captured in high definition from 4 different angles. The warehouse's exterior speakers crackled to life. Mason had recorded a message the previous night, and Marcus played it on cue. "This facility is under 24-hour licensed security surveillance. All activity is being recorded and transmitted to off-site storage. You are on private commercial property. Any attempt to obstruct, damage, or interfere with operations on these premises is being documented for immediate referral to law enforcement. You have 60 seconds to vacate the perimeter." The message played once. Silence followed. On the screens, Gwen watched the 11 men look at each other, look at the cameras they could now clearly see mounted on every corner and door frame, and begin a rapid, heated conversation that the microphones couldn't quite pick up. Then the second part of Mason's plan arrived.
3 marked patrol cars turned onto the service road from the south entrance, light bars flashing blue and red across the concrete walls of the surrounding buildings. They were followed by 2 unmarked sedans. 15 officers in total, plus a detective Gwen didn't recognize who stepped out of the lead unmarked car with a folder under her arm. Mason had made the call to law enforcement 48 hours earlier. The folder the detective carried contained copies of every piece of financial evidence Gwen had compiled, the decoded invoice numbers, the shell account information from Lakefront National, the transaction patterns, the fraudulent compliance paperwork from the freight terminal, and a detailed timeline of Cross's extortion operation against the Merchants Association. Mason's legal team had packaged it into a formal referral that gave law enforcement everything they needed to act. The 11 men at the fence found themselves caught in a geometric trap. Floodlights ahead, cameras above, patrol cars behind, and a steel-reinforced fence in between. There was no direction that led anywhere useful. One by one, they put their hands up. Gwen watched it happen on the monitors. It was strangely quiet. No shouting, no chasing, no dramatic confrontation. The officers moved in with professional calm, directing each man to step away from the vehicles and cooperate. Some of them looked relieved, honestly. The tension of the last few minutes had been building toward something ugly, and the fact that it ended with raised hands and calm voices felt like a pressure valve releasing. The detective with the folder approached one of the SUVs and spoke to the man in the passenger seat. Even on the camera feed, Gwen recognized the rigid posture and the thinning brown hair combed back from a worried forehead. Victor Cross had come to supervise his biggest operation personally, and he had walked directly into the most thoroughly documented ambush of his career. Gwen stepped away from the monitoring station and walked to the loading dock door. She pushed it open and stood on the concrete platform, looking out across the lit-up parking lot toward the north fence, where 11 men were being processed by officers under floodlights so bright they erased every shadow. The early morning air was cold enough to see her breath. Somewhere behind the industrial skyline, the first thin line of dawn was starting to separate the sky from the rooftops, turning the horizon from black to deep blue. Mason came out and stood beside her. They watched in silence as Cross was escorted to one of the unmarked sedans. He didn't struggle. He didn't shout. He walked with the stiff, mechanical steps of a man whose brain was still processing the distance between what he had expected to happen and what had actually happened. As the sedan door closed behind Cross, the detective looked toward the warehouse and gave Mason a brief acknowledging wave. Mason returned it. "It's done?" Gwen asked. "The extortion case is solid. The financial evidence ties Cross directly to the shell accounts and the laundering operation. Combined with tonight's attempted obstruction and the freight terminal incident, his legal team is going to be busy for a very long time." Gwen leaned against the dock railing. Her legs felt shaky. The adrenaline that had been holding her upright for the past hour was draining away, leaving her hollow and buzzing and oddly light, like she might float off the loading dock if she let go of the railing. She thought about Mrs. Delgado's bakery, about Mr. Yoon's fabric shop, about the weekend vendors who set up their tables every Saturday morning and counted their earnings in small, careful stacks of bills that meant everything to their families. She thought about 14 months of fear, of shrinking budgets and sleepless nights and phone calls from a man who believed he could take whatever he wanted from people who had spent their entire lives building something worth protecting. That man was sitting in the back of an unmarked car right now, watching his empire collapse through a window he couldn't roll down. Behind them, inside the warehouse, the night shift was finishing up. Forklifts beeped in reverse. Pallets slid into place. The cold storage compressors hummed their low, constant song. The supply chain was intact. The shelves would be full. The market would open on time. Denise appeared in the dock doorway with 2 cups of her terrible coffee. She handed one to Gwen and one to Mason without ceremony. "So," Denise said, looking out at the patrol cars and the floodlights and the slowly brightening sky. "Same time tomorrow night? Or can I go back to my normal shift?" Gwen laughed. It came out louder and more sudden than she expected, and it echoed off the concrete walls of the loading dock and out into the morning air where it mixed with the distant sound of the city waking up.
"Normal shift, Denise," she said. "I think we're done."
The historic market square on a Saturday afternoon in late October was a different universe from the one Gwen had walked through 9 days earlier. That morning, when she and Mason had first gathered the merchants in the main hall, the air had tasted like fear. People moved with their heads down. Conversations happened in whispers. The market had been alive in the technical sense, doors open, lights on, goods displayed, but the spirit of the place had been buried under 14 months of Victor Cross's weight. Today, the spirit was back. Gwen could hear it before she even stepped through the main entrance. Music, actual music, was pouring out of the covered walkways. Someone had set up a speaker system near the central hall, and a local band was playing cumbia while a circle of kids danced in front of the bakery. Mrs. Delgado had pulled 3 folding tables out onto the walkway and covered them with trays of conchas, empanadas, churros, and a towering tres leches cake that must have taken her half the night to assemble. Mr. Yoon had hung bolts of his brightest fabric from the awning poles, turning the east corridor into a tunnel of color, deep reds, electric blues, golds that caught the afternoon sun coming through the skylights. Every shop was open. Every stall was full. The weekend vendors had showed up in numbers Gwen hadn't seen in over a year. Not just the regulars, but people who had stopped coming months ago because the extortion payments made their slim margins impossible. They were back now, setting up tables of handmade jewelry, ceramic pots, fresh herbs bundled with kitchen twine, jars of homemade hot sauce with handwritten labels. The news about Cross had moved through the community the way important news always moves, fast, fragmented, and slightly exaggerated with each retelling. Gwen had spent much of the previous day fielding phone calls from merchants who wanted to confirm what they'd heard.
"Is it true? Is he really gone? Are we safe?"
She answered each call the same way. Yes. 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 3 small words that carried the weight of everything she and Mason had done over the past 9 days. Mason parked the SUV on the street and walked with Gwen through the main entrance. He had traded his usual suit for something more casual, a dark jacket over a simple shirt, no tie. It was the first time Gwen had seen him dressed down, and it changed the shape of him somehow, made him look less like a CEO and more like a person who might actually enjoy an afternoon at a neighborhood market. They made it about 12 feet inside before Mrs. Delgado intercepted them.
"There she is!"
Elena Delgado was a small woman with enormous energy who moved through the world like a hummingbird that had been given a bakery and strong opinions about frosting. She grabbed Gwen's hands and pulled her forward, talking at a speed that made Gwen's Spanish teacher from high school seem like a slow-motion replay.
Come, everyone is waiting. I told them you'd be here by 2 and it's already 10 past, and Mr. Yoon has been standing by the stage for 20 minutes pretending he's not nervous about his speech." "Mr. Yoon is giving a speech?"
Gwen said.
"Mr. Yoon insisted on giving a speech. I told him to keep it short because the cake is going to dry out, but you know how he gets. The man bought new reading glasses just for today. Come on."
She pulled Gwen toward the central hall with the unstoppable force of a woman who had opinions about scheduling and intended to enforce them. Mason followed a few steps behind, his hands in his jacket pockets, taking in the transformed market with an expression Gwen couldn't quite read from the angle she was being dragged at. The main hall was packed. Every merchant, every vendor, every employee, and what appeared to be half the neighborhood had gathered in the wide open space beneath the vaulted skylights. Someone had hung a banner across the stage area, hand-painted on a bedsheet in letters that wobbled slightly at the edges, that read, "Thank you, Gwen and Mason." Gwen stopped walking. Her throat went tight. She had seen this hall empty and quiet, filled with 46 scared faces looking up at her while she explained a security plan she wasn't even sure would work. She had stood on that same platform and asked these people to trust her, to trust a stranger, to believe that things could change when 14 months of evidence had told them otherwise. And they had trusted her, every single one of them. Mr. Yoon was indeed standing by the stage, wearing his new reading glasses and holding a piece of paper that he had clearly folded and unfolded about 30 times based on the condition of the creases. When he saw Gwen, he straightened his shoulders and walked to the center of the platform with the careful dignity of a man who had been rehearsing this moment in his bathroom mirror. He cleared his throat. The hall quieted gradually, the way a room full of happy people settles down. Slowly, reluctantly, with a few lingering conversations that faded out like the end of a song. "Most of you know I'm not a man who talks much," Mr. Yoon began. He held his paper in front of him, but didn't look at it. "I've run my shop in this market for 22 years. My father ran it for 18 years before me. In all that time, the hardest year was this last one. I think everyone here knows why." Quiet nods throughout the hall. A few people reached for the hands of the person standing next to them. "When Victor Cross came to this market, he told us we needed his protection. He told us we couldn't survive without him, and for a while I believed that. I think many of us did. When someone takes a piece of everything you earn, month after month, you start to feel like maybe that's just how things work. Maybe the world is built for people like him, and people like us just have to accept it." Mr. Yoon paused. He folded his paper once more, tucked it into his breast pocket, and took off his new reading glasses. Gwen Harper showed us that was a lie. The applause that followed was immediate and loud and came from every corner of the hall. Gwen pressed her lips together hard and stared at a point on the floor, because if she looked at anyone's face right now, she was going to lose the battle with her tear ducts, and she had already done enough crying in public spaces this month. "Mr." Yoon waited for the applause to settle, then continued. "Gwen kept our books when nobody asked her to. She tracked every dollar, every invoice, every payment, because she believed that the truth was in the numbers, and that someday those numbers would matter. She was right, and when she found someone willing to stand beside her," he looked at Mason, who stood near the back of the crowd with his hands still in his pockets. "She didn't hide behind him. She walked beside him, into the bank, into the meeting, into the warehouse at midnight. She put herself on the line because this market and the people in it are her family." The second round of applause was longer. Mrs. Delgado was crying openly, which set off a chain reaction among several other merchants who had been trying to maintain composure. Mr. Yoon raised his hand for quiet one last time. "So from all of us, every shop owner, every vendor, every person who makes their living in this building, thank you, Gwen. Thank you, Mr. Vance. This market has been here for almost 100 years. Because of what you did, it's going to be here for 100 more." He stepped down from the platform, walked directly to Gwen, and hugged her. Mr. Yoon, who Gwen had never once seen express physical affection toward any human being in 10 years of knowing him, wrapped his arms around her and held on like he was trying to say with his arms everything he hadn't been able to fit into his speech. Gwen hugged him back and gave up on the tear duct battle entirely. The celebration that followed lasted 3 hours. Gwen ate more conchas than she would ever publicly admit. Mason was cornered by the weekend herb vendor, an elderly man named Fausto, who spent 45 minutes explaining the medicinal properties of lemongrass and refused to let Mason leave without accepting a brown paper bag filled with enough dried herbs to stock a small pharmacy. As the afternoon stretched into early evening and the crowd thinned to the last stubborn clusters of people who weren't ready to let the day end, Gwen found Mason standing near the east corridor, looking at Mr. Yoon's fabric displays. "You've been quiet," she said. "It's your day. Didn't want to take up space." "You drove me here in your car, Mason. You're literally taking up space." He smiled at that. A real one. The kind that changed his whole face and made him look 10 years younger. "It's a good market," he said. "I can see why you fight for it." Gwen looked around at the faded brick walls, the hand-painted signs, the warm light falling through the old skylights. She could hear Fausto still talking to someone about lemongrass near the entrance. She could smell Mrs. Delgado's kitchen firing up for the evening batch. She could feel the floor under her feet, solid and worn and holding steady the way it had for almost a century. "It's home," she said. They stood there for a while longer, watching the market settle into its evening rhythm, before Gwen finally told Mason they should head back. They had one more conversation to have, and something told her it was going to be the most important one yet. The elevator to the 42nd floor was quiet at this hour. Most of the Vance Enterprises staff had gone home by 6, leaving the building to the security guards, the cleaning crew, and the faint hum of systems running on autopilot. Gwen stood beside Mason as the numbers climbed, watching her reflection in the polished steel doors. She was still wearing the clothes she'd had on at the market, a comfortable blouse, her good jeans, flat shoes that had walked about 4 miles across the market floor during the celebration. There was a faint dusting of powdered sugar on her left sleeve from the conchas. She noticed it and brushed it off, then stopped halfway through and left it. It felt like proof that the afternoon had been real. 10 days ago, she had ridden a different elevator in this building, the service elevator, the one with the scratched walls and the flickering light on the 3rd panel. She had carried a mop and a bucket of cleaning solution, and the quiet certainty that her life was divided into 2 separate worlds that would never touch. There was the world where she scrubbed floors and emptied trash cans on the 42nd floor, and there was the world where she balanced ledgers and fought for 34 small businesses on the West Side. She kept those worlds apart because mixing them felt dangerous. If the people at Vance Enterprises knew she was more than a maid, they might expect things from her. If the people at the market knew she was just a maid, they might trust her less. So she had kept her head down, done her job, and carried everything alone. The elevator doors opened onto the executive hallway. The same marble floor she had mopped hundreds of times stretched out before her, gleaming under the recessed lighting. Her cleaning cart was gone. Someone else had covered her shift this past week. The hallway looked the same as always, but walking through it felt completely different when you weren't pushing a mop. Mason led her to his office and held the door open. The room was exactly as she remembered from that first afternoon. The walnut desk, the bookshelves, the monitors, the world's okayest boss mug sitting on the coffee station with a dried ring inside it. The city stretched out beyond the windows, a sprawl of lights beginning to flicker on as evening settled over Chicago. From up here, Gwen could see the West Side, not the individual streets or buildings, but the general shape of it, the neighborhood where the market sat, tucked among residential blocks, like a heartbeat at the center of a living body. Mason didn't sit behind his desk. He pulled out 2 chairs at the conference table by the window, the same table where they had first gone through her financial records, and gestured for her to sit. She sat. He sat across from her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The office was quiet enough to hear the building's ventilation system breathing softly through the ceiling vents. "I want to offer you a position," Mason said. Gwen had been expecting something like this. She had felt it building over the past few days, in the way Mason consulted her before making decisions, in the way his team had started directing questions to her instead of routing everything through him, in the way he looked at her during the warehouse operation, like she was someone he wanted on his side permanently. "What kind of position?" she asked. "Director of Community Development for Vance Enterprises." Gwen blinked. She had expected something, maybe a consulting role, maybe an advisory position, something part-time that would let her keep one foot in each world the way she always had. Director was a different word entirely. It sat heavier in the air. "The role would focus on small business protection across the city," Mason continued, "identifying communities being targeted by extortion, financial fraud, supply chain manipulation, everything Cross was doing to your market There are people doing it to neighborhoods all over Chicago. Most of those neighborhoods don't have someone like you keeping the books and catching the patterns. I want to build a division that does what you did, systematically, at scale. And you want me to run it. I want you to build it, from the ground up. You'd have a team, a budget, and full authority over operations. You report to me, but the division is yours. Your methods, your priorities, your calls. Gwen looked down at her hands. They were resting on the conference table. The same hands that had mopped this floor, that had decoded Cross's invoices on a yellow legal pad, that had navigated a bank's compliance terminal with the precision of a surgeon. Her nails were short and unpolished. There was a small callus on her right middle finger from years of gripping pens and mop handles with equal intensity. Mason, 10 days ago I was your cleaning lady. I sat on the floor outside this office and cried because I didn't know how to save a market full of people counting on me. And you picked up the phone and stepped into a situation that had nothing to do with you. It had everything to do with me. I just didn't know it yet. Why? You still haven't really answered that. You gave me a reason that first day, something about stopping men like Cross before they spread, and I believed that. But you could have made a few calls, sent your security team, handled it at arm's length. You didn't. You drove to the market yourself. You sat in a diner across from a man who threatened you to your face. You stayed up all night in a warehouse drinking Denise's terrible coffee. That's not just business strategy. Mason was quiet for a long moment. He looked out the window at the city lights. My mother ran a laundromat on the south side for 23 years, he said. Small place, 6 machines, a folding table, and a TV mounted on the wall that only got 4 channels. When I was 12, a man walked in and told her she owed him $500 a month for the privilege of staying open on his block. She couldn't pay. She tried to fight it. Within 6 months, her suppliers cut her off, her landlord doubled her rent, and she closed the doors on a Tuesday afternoon in March. I came home from school and found her sitting on the steps outside the locked storefront with a cardboard box of hangers in her lap. He paused. The ventilation system breathed. Nobody helped her. She asked, and nobody came. I was 12 years old, and I made a decision sitting on those steps that I would never be the person who didn't come when someone asked. Gwen felt something shift in her chest, a rearrangement of understanding, like a puzzle piece turning until it finally clicked into the gap it was made for. She had spent 10 days trying to figure out what drove this man, what engine sat beneath the calm exterior and the strategic mind and the tailored suits. Now she knew. It was the same engine that drove her. The memory of watching someone you love lose everything while the world looked the other way. Director of Community Development, she said slowly, testing the weight of each word. Full authority. Your division. Your rules. I have conditions. Mason raised an eyebrow. The market comes first. Always. Whatever else this division does, the historic market stays under our protection, permanently. Mrs. Delgado, Mr. Yoon, Fausto, the weekend vendors, they're not case files. They're family. Done. And I want Denise Okafor on my team. That woman can organize a night shift in the middle of a crisis without breaking a sweat. I need people like that. Send me her information tomorrow. Gwen looked at him across the table. The city glowed behind him, thousands of small lights in thousands of windows, each one representing someone's kitchen, someone's shop, someone's late-night effort to build or keep or protect something that mattered to them. Then yes, she said. I'll take the job. Mason extended his hand across the table. Gwen took it. His grip was firm and steady, and so was hers. They stood and walked together to the window. 42 floors below, Chicago moved through its evening. Cars on the expressway, trains pulling into stations, the west side settling into the amber glow of street lights and porch lights and the warm rectangles of shop windows that would open again tomorrow morning.
because a woman with a legal pad and a calculator had refused to let them go dark. Gwen placed her palm flat against the cool glass. Somewhere out there, past the towers and the highways and the river, the historic market was closing up for the night. Mrs. Delgado was wiping down her counters. Mr. Yoon was folding his last bolt of fabric. The weekend vendors were counting their earnings, small, careful stacks of bills that meant everything. Tomorrow, Gwen would start building something new. A team, a division, a system designed to find the next neighborhood being squeezed and the next person sitting on a floor somewhere, crying into a phone, believing that nobody was coming to help. She would come.
The way Mason had come for her, the way she wished someone had come for his mother on that Tuesday afternoon in March all those years ago.
"It's a good view," she said quietly.
Mason stood beside her, hands in his pockets, watching the same city. "It's better with a partner," he said. Below them, Chicago kept moving, restless, imperfect, and full of people worth fighting for.